Are you looking to become a Tier 1 operator in the gaming world? Elevate your games with Black Site Studio Terrain.
Welcome back, everyone, to the Ops Center, where we feature wargame-focused overviews of modern conflicts. The Ops Center is part of the Sitrep podcast channel, bringing you modern military gaming content on YouTube, Podbean, Twitch, Facebook, on tabletop.com, and other platforms. If you like what you see, please consider subscribing or following the Sitrep on one of these platforms. You can also support us on Patreon, or check out our great Sitrep merchandise on Zazzle.com. Today we're closing out our look at the Vietnam War. We've reviewed the war's background and overall course, looked at its different areas of geography, and finally the tactics and conditions of the war and how to bring these factors to the game. Now let's wrap up with a summary of how Vietnam ended, why it turned out the way it did, and how it affected the landscape of modern warfare. The objectives of the Vietnam War from the start were drastically different for both sides. While the communists wanted to topple the Saigon government and unite all of Vietnam, the Americans and their allies sought only to keep South Vietnam independent. The general fear was that a communist win in Vietnam would lead to some kind of domino effect. In other words, if Vietnam went communist, so might Cambodia, Thailand, Laos, and Burma. Note that America's allies in the war, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, Laos, Thailand, and the Philippines, these are all Asia-Pacific nations concerned with that same fear of communism in their backyard. Of course, the Tinfoil Brigade will spew theories about all-powerful cliques of Pentagon generals or shadowy tycoons of the military-industrial complex. This is easily refuted nonsense, a retroactive projection of post-Vietnam cynicism. The fact is, generals are trained for decades to follow the orders of a civilian authority, and even if not, they have no legal authority to deploy troops anyway. Even the President of the United States needed the Tonkin Gulf Resolution passed by Congress in 1964. While secretive organizations like the CIA or the NSA can be cited for dirty war operations before this is a far cry from 500,000 American troops and tens of billions of dollars deployed in country for over 10 years. As for the defense industrialists, remember, they were already making tens of billions of dollars by selling arms to corrupt regimes in Thailand, South Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. So the idea of capitalist covens instigating this war for profit doesn't wash either. As for the communists, their objectives are actually a little more complex. Remember, we're talking about two distinct bodies here, the North Vietnamese Army and the Viet Cong. The NVA was controlled out of Hanoi, most notably by General Vo Nguyen Giap. The Viet Cong was largely controlled by COSFIN, or the Central Office for South Vietnam. Again, these are South Vietnamese communists, who were very often at odds with their North Vietnamese comrades. The communist Vietnamese were also conflicted in regards to relations with the rest of the communist world. This was especially true with Vietnam's ancient blood enemy, China. While Cold War politics may have made Mao and Uncle Ho strange bedfellows for a time, old habits and old rivalries die hard. So Hanoi always had to walk a fine line between accepting desperately needed military aid from China and becoming too reliant on them. This became particularly tricky after the Sino-Soviet split of the 1960s, and even more so when US-China relations started to warm under the Nixon administration in the early 1970s. This brings us to the Cold War context and Vietnam's place in this much larger global struggle. Obviously, the Americans were committed to stopping the spread of communism wherever they could. Ultimately, the only real reason they were in Vietnam at all. Again, they feared the domino effect we were talking about before, and a new bloc of Asian communist countries behind what was already being called the Bamboo Curtain. So, how valid was this fear? Well, Cambodia did go communist, sort of. Also, economic revolutions were just getting started in places like Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. These strong, democratic, and soon-to-be very rich allies would form vital links in a chain against Chinese expansion across the Pacific Rim. However, a communist Southeast Asia could threaten the shipping lanes for Persian Gulf oil that was going to be vital for these new economies. All that said, communist uprisings had admittedly already been put down in places like Malaya by the British and Indonesia twice. Cambodia aside, the idea of a communist tide across Southeast Asia pretty much proved to be a mirage, even after Hanoi completely won the Vietnam War. Getting out of Vietnam was always a goal of first the Johnson and especially the Nixon administrations. But the Americans couldn't just leave. Their credibility as a leader of the free world would be forever damaged. So they strove toward the idea of peace with honor, strengthening the South Vietnamese government and army to the point where they could resist the communist war efforts on their own. But there were repeated stumbling blocks to the ongoing peace talks in Paris, including the recovery of American POWs. Often the North Vietnamese refused to attend the peace talks at all. But expanded American bombing of North Vietnam, including much heavier aircraft like B-52s, hitting targets long considered hands-off, finally helped bring the North Vietnamese around. Geopolitical pressure like the gradual thaw of relations between the United States and China, and the advent of détente between the Americans and the Soviets also played a role. After all, Hanoi was finding itself in danger of becoming isolated from international support, so they opted to make a deal when they could. The Americans were also under political pressure, with Nixon having promised to end the war, and he was now running for a second term in the Oval Office. The Paris Accords that he finally managed to secure, these were a sham. A pretty shameful excuse for the Americans to simply get out of Vietnam as soon as possible under the flimsiest of pretense. The communists didn't even have to withdraw from parts of South Vietnam they presently controlled. This brings us to the end game of the Vietnam War. Even after the Americans withdrew their ground forces in March 1973, fighting between South Vietnamese units and guerrillas never really ended. Furthermore, once American bombing halted, the North Vietnamese were able to rebuild the Ho Chi Minh Trail very quickly, allowing the NVA to again build up strength in and around South Vietnam. A renewed communist offensive during the winter of 1973-74 officially restarted the war. Viet Cong leaders in South Vietnam were optimistic, and they pushed the North Vietnamese to support a full-scale invasion of South Vietnam at once. But the North hesitated, not wanting to provoke an American return. Hanoi did have a full-scale invasion plan all set up and ready to go, but not until 1976. After the end of Nixon's second term. But even this threat started to dwindle when Nixon became embroiled in the Watergate scandal. Nixon was soon forced to resign the Oval Office, and his replacement, President Gerald Ford, seemed unwilling to re-involve the United States in a rekindled Vietnam War. Sure enough, when Hanoi finally gambled on a limited ground offensive into South Vietnam in December of '74, American support for the South Vietnamese forces was notably absent. No airstrikes came, and President Ford was denied by Congress for extensions and expansions for financial support to Saigon. Emboldened, the Communists opened a larger but still limited offensive in March of '75, sometimes called the Central Highlands Offensive or Campaign 275. This Communist offensive was a massive success. Although South Vietnamese forces were actually larger than the Communist forces in many respects, the South Vietnamese Republic Army was badly organized, poorly led, and undersupplied. Attacked by the NVA from the front and undermined by the Viet Cong behind them, successive Arvent brigades completely fell apart, and most of South Vietnam was lost with thunderclap speed. By now, even the cautious leaders in Hanoi realized that a historic moment was at hand. Plans for the, quote, real general offensive of 1976 were shelved in favor of an immediate push to end this war all at once. The so-called Ho Chi Minh offensive was launched right away. This time, Arvin managed to put up a respectable resistance in places, including a climactic battle at Swan Lok in April 1975. This brief, very brief, flash of South Vietnamese backbone, organization, and competence is probably your best bet for really big, conventional, flames of war style battles in Vietnam. Swan Lok was huge, a conventional combined arms battle with Arvin M41 Walker Bulldog tanks up against large numbers of PAVN T-54s and T-55s. In any event, the writing was on the wall. By the end of April 75, the South Vietnamese president had fled the country, Saigon itself was under attack, and the last Americans were evacuated from the U.S. Embassy. Although dogged Arvin resistance would continue in the Mekong Delta for a time, the Vietnam War had effectively ended in a conclusive communist victory on April 30th, 1975. What went wrong is a question that sparks controversy and debate to this very day. How did one of the most powerful war machines on Earth lose this war? The question is a complex one, and I won't even try and tackle it entirely here, especially since so much of the answer lies in social, political, and cultural factors beyond the purview of this series. Sticking strictly with the military aspect, well, in the very broadest of strokes, the communists simply wanted victory more. This war was personal for them. For the Americans, it was something they had to get through. Communist soldiers, leaders, and supporters were willing to pay a much higher price, and keep paying that price, over a much longer period. This imbalance was made worse by the corruption, weakness, and post-colonial elitism of the Saigon South Vietnamese government. The average communist soldier genuinely believed that he or she was really saving Vietnam, while the Americans could never really claim the moral high ground, and even their own soldiers knew it. Furthermore, after early battles like Operation Starlight and Ai Drang, the communists saw what American material strengths were and realigned their strategy to avoid these strengths and take them out of the battlefield equation. Conversely, American weaknesses became more and more apparent through 1966 and 67, and were soon specifically targeted by communist doctrine and planning. These included, but were certainly not limited to, number 1, American tours of duty were limited to roughly 13 months per soldier. This meant that men were constantly leaving field units. There was never a real buildup of combat experience, and units were constantly under strength. Number 2. By and large, the Americans fielded a conscript army of draftees that never really supported, much less understood, why they were fighting this war in the first place. Number 3. Supporting a thoroughly hated regime in Saigon meant that the Americans never had a real chance of getting the South Vietnamese population on their side. Number 4. Having truly poor allies, and I use that term very loosely, in the form of the Army of the Republic of Vietnam. Seriously, these guys were worthless. In fact, they were an actual liability. Number 5. The complete inability to control the image of the war under the eyes of a media machine with no constraints or filters whatsoever. While free speech, an independent fourth estate, and transparency in government is vital to any non-totalitarian society, war does present justifiable exceptions to this concept. Number 6. The Americans failed to realize that most of their enemies, especially among the Viet Cong, were in fact South Vietnamese, the very people they thought they were defending. Number 7. Excessive oversight by the civilian political authorities into operational and even tactical military decisions, up to and including the United States President selecting and choosing each and every bombing target in North Vietnam. Number 8. The American government never made any real attempt to win and maintain American public support for this war. Most American politicians of the day had grown up, so to speak, during World War II, when Pearl Harbor had made public support for the war a foregone conclusion. But that was not the case here, and civilian opposition to the war soon bled into the troops deployed in the field. Thus started an ever-increasing cycle of declining morale, deteriorating discipline, and drug abuse. The communists correctly identified and exploited every one of these weaknesses, all while rendering their own shortfalls non-issues by refusing the kind of battles, the kind of war that the American military was designed to wage. They applied pressure and kept up the pressure simply by continuing to exist, and maintained this until the Americans just couldn't do it anymore. At the risk of sounding glib, the Americans straight out just didn't want to be there. Even those that did often couldn't explain the full justifications. They were supporting a government that didn't deserve to be protected, putting them at odds with the population they thought they were defending. The voters didn't want them there, which meant that the politicians wouldn't want them there, and since most of the military had never wanted to be there in the first place, the only sane question seemed to be, why are we still here, and why did we ever come in the first place? The outcome of the Vietnam War brought on something of a dark age for the American military. Through most of the 1970s, American doctrine and overall readiness seemed to stagger through a hazy lack of confidence. The only unifying principle seemed to be, how can we ensure something like Vietnam never happens again? It wasn't until the 1980s that the lessons of Vietnam were sufficiently absorbed into the American military to germinate fundamental and widespread organizational change, yet had also faded just enough for the American military to overcome its confidence and image problems of the 1970s. There would be dark days in the 1980s, but small successes like Grenada, the Gulf of Sitrep in Libya, and Operation Just Cause in Panama showed that the American military was recovering. But it wasn't until 1990 and 91, with Operations Desert Shield and Desert Storm, that the American military fully proved it had grown beyond the Vietnam experience. The American military had completely switched to a smaller but highly motivated all-volunteer force. They enforced a plan that maximized their strengths and exploited enemy weaknesses. They allowed media access to the war effort, but on the American military's terms, ensuring that they controlled the war's overall image. They kept the war short, with sharply defined goals and a clear exit strategy. Virtually every weak point that we listed before had been addressed decisively and fundamentally, and the results speak for themselves. At the same time, we really have to ask, have some of the lessons of Vietnam been forgotten? When the Americans invaded Iraq in 2003, once again they became embroiled in a war whose justification many could not accept. Once again the war would prove a long one, against an insurgent foe who refused a stand-up fight, alongside an incapable local army and corrupt government often in league with the enemy. Once again there was no exit strategy, and once again the public largely turned against the war. So perhaps some of the ghosts of Vietnam haunt us still. One last echo of Vietnam can be found in a surprising place: science fiction. There are at least two major science fiction franchises I can think of that directly draw from this experience. The first is The Forever War by Joe Haldeman, a combat engineer wounded in Vietnam who used the experience as a basis for his Hugo Award-winning science fiction war novel, later adopted into a board game and a graphic novel series. The second is the Hammer Slammer series by David Drake, who served as an intelligence officer with 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment in South Vietnam. In both cases, these sci-fi settings and conflicts are clearly safe analogs where the commentary on the Vietnam War, the veteran experience, and other factors can be expressed in a less uncomfortable manner. But I bring them up here because not only are both of these franchises represented in the gaming community, but they also offer glimpses into how lessons, tactics, and history of the Vietnam War can be used even outside historical wargaming. Interestingly, even the complete communist victory in Vietnam did not end Vietnam's war. Even while the NVA battle tanks approached the outskirts of Saigon, a brand new pro-communist government, the Khmer Rouge, took power in Cambodia. American fears of a domino effect seemed to be coming true. But almost immediately, conflict flared up between communist regimes in Cambodia and the newly unified Vietnam. The reasons are complex. The Khmer Rouge was supported by Communist China, and China and Vietnam are longtime foes. This split grew worse after the rift between the Chinese and the Soviets in the 1960s, and Vietnam drifted further into the orbit of Moscow rather than Beijing. After a steady escalation of border clashes and humanitarian atrocities in Cambodia, Vietnam, backed by the Soviet Union, invaded Cambodia on Christmas Day 1978 and deposed the Khmer Rouge. More red-on-red warfare was quick to follow. Enraged by Vietnam's destruction of their Khmer Rouge vassals, the Chinese invaded North Vietnam in February 1979. This war was actually pretty big, pitting 200,000 Chinese against 120,000 Vietnamese, with extensive tank and artillery forces on both sides. Ironically, the Vietnamese were using a lot of American equipment here, mostly taken from the South Vietnamese after the collapses of 1975. So if big flames of war-style tank battles in Vietnam are your thing, consider the Sino-Vietnamese War of 1979 sort of an out-of-the-box option as your background. You can have M41 and M48 tanks among those to put up against your Chinese Type 59s and Type 62s. As with most modern wars, this was a limited conflict. Fighting officially ended in March. Chinese goals were to compel a Vietnamese withdrawal from Cambodia, which didn't happen for another 10 years. Only then did fighting between Vietnam and China completely end. Relations remain tense to this day, as they have been for hundreds of years. However, this has resulted in something of a silver lining for Vietnam into the 21st century, since relations between China have grown steadily worse with the United States, Australia, and the Philippines, especially in the South China Sea. Therefore, Vietnam is becoming an increasingly valuable trading partner and geopolitical counterweight to the Chinese in this region. Honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if Vietnam became an outright ally in the very near future. So this wraps up our series on the Vietnam War. We hope you've enjoyed these videos and picked up a little background to use as context in your Vietnam games and campaigns. But now we've heard enough of my yammering on this topic. What do you think about the context, impact, and lingering effects of the Vietnam War? How do you represent the motivations and morale of troops on your tables? What parallels do you draw between Vietnam and other conflicts, past, present, or future? How about parallels in other genres, like the science fiction we were talking about before? Tell us what's on your mind in the comments below. For now, this is Ariskany, and as always, Tango Mike for listening.